The topic for this week with Awakening the Warrior author Richard Charles Lawrence is why is cultural appropriation essential for innovation and problem solving?
Okay.
So first question is, why are we talking about it?
Yeah. So you may remember that my kind of shorthand for problem solving is threefold. Know yourself, know the enemy, know the battleground. And part of knowing the battleground is understanding what prevailing ideas are around in the ether in whatever era you live in. And it just so happens that we live in a time where certain ideas are quite omnipresent in the media and through various channels. And one of which of them is this idea of cultural appropriation.
Okay. What is the definition of cultural appropriation is the next question.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the first thing you've got to do is understand what you're talking about. And the idea of cultural appropriation, it came out of sociology. And it's particularly to do with the idea that you might have a majority or dominant culture and a minority culture. And it is the idea, and it is an idea, that when the dominant culture draws in elements from a minority culture without necessarily understanding the context and having a full grasp of what the roots of the thing are, then that is tantamount to theft. And the idea in this cultural appropriation is that that somehow diminishes the culture that you've taken it from.
I see.
And in that sense, in the original meaning of it, it's almost like a form of colonialism, like a form of cultural colonialism. That's the idea.
Okay.
What we've actually seen, though, I think, is a creeping of this term to be a bit more wider. And so perhaps things that might have been understood as being cultural exchange, even when the term was first muted and the idea first came about, is now also sometimes being called cultural appropriation.
Right. Okay.
And the word appropriation is important as opposed to cultural exchange, because the idea is, like the word appropriation suggests, there is some sort of theft taking place.
Okay. And why is it essential, do you think, to innovation and problem solving?
Right. Whenever you create something new, you have to change perspective. Otherwise, you'd always be stuck doing what you've always done.
Right.
And what I am suggesting here is that the way that innovation has always occurred and the way that it will continue to occur is that you take in influences from a wider sphere as you can in order to change your perspective. In other words, you get new eyes on things. This is why people talk about travel broadening the mind. But going further than that, it's often true that the best solutions or the best new ideas come when actually you don't understand the original context of the thing you're taking it from. Because when you take it out of its context and you put it into a new context, that energy is what creates something new. If you were to fully understand completely the cultural context and the roots that you were borrowing or taking the thing from, then actually you would bring with it the limitations that's on it. And the way that something has been put in its correct, in inverted commas, correct context. So I would say that this idea of cultural appropriation, or whatever you want to call it, is actually very, very important for creating new ideas and for solving problems in new and innovative ways.
Okay. Are there any historic examples that you could discuss about how cultural appropriation has brought about good things?
Well, I think one that we could probably understand from popular culture is the way that hip-hop developed.
Okay.
So if we look in I mean, it's interesting to me and it's funny to me because people will sometimes, you see it on Twitter and everything, will sometimes say, oh, look at that person, he's stolen from hip-hop culture. And I think, well, that's a funny thing to say, because what's amazing about hip-hop music and the way it developed is it is the ultimate thing that sucked in different cultural influences. So to take Afrika Bambaataa as our example, guy coming from New York, whose real name isn't Afrika Bambaataa,
right.
but he developed that sort of persona.
Mm-hmm.
he went to Africa, came back, and then he said, as to do a positive thing, because there was a lot of problems with gangs where he lived, that he would create the Zulu nation, because he was influenced by the figure of Shaka Zulu.
Okay.
But none of them were Zulus. I mean, the Zulus are a specific, ethnic tribe in Africa. Shaka Zulu was a conqueror. He was somebody who fought battles, won battles, increased the influence of the Zulus. But they took that idea from Africa, even though they weren't Zulus. It doesn't matter, because they're creating something new. And in some ways, they're doing that thing that I'm talking about, where you take something out of context, and maybe not necessarily understanding the full effects of it, and create something new. And then musically, one of the big influences on, for example, Planet Rock, one of the Afrika Bambaataa tunes, is Kraftwerk. So you're talking about taking an influence from 4 German guys, creating quite industrial, innovative, experimental electronic music. And you're saying, right, we'll have that, and we'll put it in a completely new context. Now, I don't know how much Afrika Bambaataa understood about German culture, the roots of where that industrial music comes from and everything. But that doesn't really matter, because when he heard it, he went, that's interesting. Now that's got something. Can't really say what it is, but I'm going to put that into this new context, and we're going to create something new. And the whole of the hip hop music has been drawing in different influences, not worrying about whether you understand the full context. Just saying there's something about that I like listening to, so I'm going to pull it in and I'm going to create something new. This is the way you solve a problem of how to create a new creative expression, which of course is exactly what they did.
Mm-hmm. So could you say, for example, yoga is a form of cultural appropriation to some people?
Well, the cultural appropriation word is interesting, because if you view it as theft, like for example, if you had, a bottle of whiskey,
yeah,
and I took that bottle of whiskey from you, I stole it from you, you haven't got that bottle of whiskey anymore, have you?
Right.
But if you look at the example of taking a sample from Kraftwerk and putting it into your own song, well, Kraftwerk music doesn't cease to exist.
Okay.
It still exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can argue about whether it's diminished or not,
yeah,
or whether actually it's maybe brought to a new audience.
Yeah.
So if somebody hears Planet Rock by Afrika Bambaataa, and what's that sample? And then they can go back to and then maybe even it gets new people into Kraftwerk. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
But it doesn't diminish it in any way. Where perhaps the original sociological term came from is this idea that there's a power, it's about power base. You've got a strong dominant culture and a minority culture which is less well exposed, and that in some way it diminishes that original culture. That is the proposition they will tell you. But then you get crazy things like we've seen recently, where a girl in America wears a Chinese inspired dress. And it's like, well, if you're going to call that cultural appropriation, even if you agree with the original definition of it, even if you agree with it, well, where's the power inequality there between the Chinese and between America? You might say, well, the Chinese are a minority in America. Maybe that is your argument. But I don't see in any way how it would diminish
Mm-hmm.
their culture by doing that. I think the Chinese culture is probably strong enough to not be diminished by it.
Yeah.
And where does it become a homage? Where does it become the natural process of us sucking in? You go, oh, I like that about what they've got. And I'd have thought the other day that even from the very beginnings of trade with people, that must have happened.
Right.
So, for example, when the Vikings, great traders, came across people they hadn't encountered before, there's Olaf there or whoever it is, and he's going, I like those beads. That's cool, And this is genuinely how trade works. They would go a bomb in this place selling to the girls of the tribe because that looks fantastic. That is exactly the way trade works. And you think it might be frivolous, but there was a huge trade in things like beads and things of costumes and all that kind of thing, precisely because it's different. And that's what people like, isn't it? I mean, that's novelty. Mm-hmm. Is how things progress. Well, I like those beads. I don't really understand the meaning behind them, but we'll order 200 of them. And fantastic! This is trade,
right?
And it's how ideas are exchanged. You think about this country in England and about how we were colonised by the Romans which brought a huge cultural influence into this country. And then when they left, we had a further cultural influx from, you know, the Jutes, the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles and the Saxons and the Frisians, and they brought things in new, like their language, for example, or, you know, what we call now Old English or Anglo-Saxon, which was further influenced as a language by French when the Normans came in. And so you've got, you know, Old English, you've got Middle English like Chaucer, so it even has an effect on the language. And then you've got its progression into early modern English like Shakespeare and then beyond. You know, English has been fascinating as a language because it sucks in so many different influences. Right. Is that cultural appropriation? I don't know what it is, but that is the way that things progress anyway.